If we could get Force 851 en route as well to help with evacuations in front of the fire. Be advised, the wind has shifted and now the fire is moving to the east-northeast direction.
The fire was just roaring straight towards us, and it was loud and thunderous. It sounded like a freight train that was coming at us.
500-acre fire on this side of the Cascades. There is not a fire department in Western Washington that can handle that event by themselves.
We just are not managing our forests, and the choice is we can either manage them or we can let them burn.
Hoping for a damp, wet summer is not a strategy.
The ability for us to stop all forest fires, it's just not realistic.
There's really not good access for vehicles.
We've heard it said time and again that when calamity strikes, it takes a village to recover. But when it involves raging wildfires sweeping across vast acres of land in just a matter of days, recovery might require more than community resilience. In this episode of Field Report, we explore how the state legislature aims to address wildfires in Washington state. Washington state,
oh my goodness,
is no stranger to wildfires.
Okay, well, I'm afraid this little town's gonna burn right here. We'll see if they can save it.
And with over 2 million homes at risk, it's only gotten worse in the past decade alone.
It's forcing people who live directly southwest of Highway 410 in Bonnie Lake to either get out or prepare to leave at a moment's notice.
Historically in Washington state, a catastrophic fire season would have been an anomaly. Unfortunately, in pretty quick time, it has become the reverse. All it takes is one spark. Instead of a 100-acre fire, you have a 1,000-acre fire.
The issue of wildfires in Washington state has drawn polarizing political opinions between eastern and western Washington, with the east experiencing more fires than the west in any given year. Washingtonians remember the jarring tragedy brought by the 2020 Labor Day fires in the small town of Malden, where 56 fires burned in just 24 hours, leaving 85% of its buildings completely decimated by the fire. Intense flames forced evacuations on many residents, choking from the smoke that soaked in an otherwise peaceful landscape. And perhaps its most crushing loss, a little boy's life whose family tried to escape it.
Just north of Chelan on 97, I believe.
Yet for the eastern side of the Cascades, the threat doesn't end there.
We have communities that are at greater risk than the town of Malden. We have communities that are at higher risk than Paradise, California, and we all remember the complete devastation of that community.
There's a good boy, good boy.
Republican Representative Joel Kretz owns a ranch in northeast Washington, an area highly prone to wildfires, and one that endured the second largest fire in the state's history, the Okanagan Complex Fire. To him, the issue of wildfires is just a little too personal, not just for his county, but for other ranch and cattle owners that side of the state.
You know, they're just getting their rangeland, this is cattle ranchers, just getting their rangeland back into good shape, the grass is coming good, and then another fire. You know, and you can't take that every 3, 4, 5 years, or you're gone. You just see the impacts, and there's a huge human impact. It's not just the environment, it's not just wildlife and cattle and everything else. There's a human cost.
Those are not clouds, that is smoke.
Yeah.
And this is our neighborhood.
Meanwhile, in western Washington,
Visual 14 affirmative, left visual marching through the forest.
Where a bustling urban population precedes a low risk for wildfires, a new threat has emerged: wildland-urban interface fires. Where houses near wooded areas dot the landscape and gusts of wind can knock down power lines, creating the perfect storm, ripe for a raging catastrophe. The largest one happened in 2020, when the Sumner Great Fire burned through 800 acres of land, including this quiet residential neighborhood in Bonnie Lake, Pierce County, forcing multiple families out of their homes.
Hearing terminology like level 1, 2, and 3 evacuations, that's somewhat of a foreign term on this side of the state.
Standing on what little remains from a home that burned down, East Pierce Fire Chief John Parkinson recalls the worst wildland-urban interface fire in western Washington.
Overnight, we had numerous downed trees caused by the strong winds. Those trees ended up taking out power lines, arcing a transformer, which spread to the ground. That brush quickly caught fire and turned into what was ultimately a 500-acre wildfire. We evacuated over 7,000 residents, lost 2 homes, numerous outbuildings and vehicles.
He says they were not equipped to fight a fire 500 times the size of what they're used to. And on top of that, resources were spread thin.
During fires that are in eastern Washington, a lot of those resources through state mobilization come from western Washington to go help fight those fires. But that takes away our resources to fight a fire on this side, and that would overwhelm us, because by the time we're on an incident for a week, putting that many personnel on it, we completely burn out our workforce and are unable to sustain that effort ourselves.
A reality which doesn't surprise DNR Commissioner Hillary Franz.
When I came here in 2017, we had 7 helicopters to fight fires in every corner of the state. They all fought in the Vietnam War. It's a symbol of how underinvested we as a state have been in wildfire. We had 40 full-time firefighters, and we're the state's firefighting agency. We're begging, borrowing, stealing for aircraft and firefighters, and usually coming up short versus ensuring we have enough. We also don't have them quick enough.
But the sharing of resources doesn't just happen between East and West. It crosses state lines too. And when both California and Oregon have critical fires, that's a recipe for disaster.
Many of our states in western United States are on fire before us, and they keep on being on fire even well past us. Every year we keep putting a cry out for more air resources, for more firefighters, for more equipment, and every year we come up short. And they're out there for 16-plus-hour days for weeks on end. We had some firefighters that were out there for over 36 hours with no break.
It's hard, very laborious work.
After a near-fatal fight for his life, former U.S. Forest Service wildland firefighter Daniel Lyon lived to tell his own story.
Because we aren't necessarily always rolling around in a great big fire truck and going into burning buildings and spraying them with water. A lot of times what we do is we use hand tools.
In 2015, Lyon responded to the Twist River Fire, which burned over 11,000 acres and 20 homes in the Okanagan complex.
The visibility was so diminished because of the smoke and pure flame that the driver of the engine ended up veering off to the right-hand side of the road and crashed into a steep ravine. And in that moment, I knew it was either die right there in that fire or try to escape and run on foot. I got down to my safety zone. My clothes were essentially melting off of me. I had burns all over my body. And I remember my boots got cut off of me by another firefighter, and they set them off to the side in the grass, and they were still smoldering and smoking. And I remember seeing that and just realizing the intensity of what I just went through and what my buddies had just went through and all the other firefighters.
And that was the last he's seen of them. The same flames they tried to contain claimed 3 lives that night. Tom Bachevsky, 20 years old, Andrew Zajac, 26, and Richard Wheeler, 31. Medics rushed the scene to treat Lion and transport him to an emergency burn unit, with him critically on the edge of death.
This time the adrenaline was wearing off and I was going into shock. I was starting to get really cold and the pain was just excruciating at this point. I asked them to give me anything and everything that they could in that moment, and they did, and then everything kind of went black.
He suffered near-fatal burns on over 65% of his body, twice than what the average human body can survive. After waking up from a month-long coma under intensive care, Lion underwent more than 100 medical procedures, including skin grafts, with 9 of his fingertips amputated because they were so badly burned. Since his recovery, he no longer works for the U.S. Forest Service and now spends his time advocating for firefighter support.
So they bring in and recruit a lot of new firefighters, and some of them are young and inexperienced, like myself was that year.
When asked what went wrong and if it could have been avoided, Lion said he hopes for better safety standards and hands-on training for present and future firefighters.
There needed to be a little bit more training or better resources at the time for our radio communication, because that was a big problem that day. A lot of it was online-based training, which is not effective for such a hands-on and dangerous job like that. To me, that's something that has haunted me ever to this day, because I do think, could the outcome have been different if the training standards were substantially higher than what they were?
Lion may have given up battling fires, but now he's suited up for a different fight, making sure wildland firefighters have a seat at the table within the communities they serve, and that they have a voice in wildfire legislation.
I realized a lot of shortfalls in the system as far as the resources go that help wildland firefighters after they're injured. I was out of work, and looking back, I had bills in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, and those are extremely stressful. I know every year since, there has been several more instances like mine where wildland firefighters have gotten extremely hurt and even killed. That was really difficult for me, and I had to fight for a lot of the resources that I needed, such as counseling and a lot of the post-traumatic stress that comes with such a traumatic event.
One step. One step.
Training resources had been really cut at the federal level.
Okay, right there. So now we're gonna walk.
Training was frankly inadequate.
You're gonna be walking backwards, vert, stoop, you're gonna be walking forward.
We began a training program here at Department of Natural Resources, not just for our own firefighters, but for local and federal firefighters.
And that federal versus local divide runs deeper than land ownership. It doesn't matter which agency manages what land or who's accountable in deploying resources, because the obvious problem is fire is border agnostic. If conditions are ripe, it will take what it will. And in Washington state, federal forests pose the most risk for wildfires.
Really, it's a failure of Congress.
Something both Democratic and Republican legislators in eastern and western Washington agree with.
You've got a lot of eastern congressmen, senators that have never been around a fire. They don't understand the ecology out here, and frankly, they've failed to fund it.
The lack of attention to forest health, that thinning, clearing, controlled burning on U.S. forest land has contributed a lot to the problem. Most of the forest in the state of Washington is owned by the federal government. They don't do a particularly good job of managing their forests.
There aren't enough resources at the federal level and in other states. So our number one job has been trying to make Washington state more dependent on itself to be able to protect our communities and our firefighters from these fires.
You know, everybody likes to blame the Forest Service or the federal land managers, and I do too. But a number of these fires could have been put out, but the feds would prefer to let them burn because they've got incredibly mismanaged forests and they know if they go and try and do a treatment or a timber sale, they'll get sued and they'll be litigated and nothing will happen. They'll spend a bunch of money in the court system, but there's nothing on the ground. And we've kind of gotten caught in that trap over the last 30 years of not aggressively managing our forests.
When we're talking about wildland fire, we're not just talking about fire. We're really talking about the overall health of an entire ecosystem.
Catherine Caruso works for the U.S. Forest Service's Pacific Northwest Division. She says not all wildfire combating strategies are cut and dried.
Where we start to really stress the system is when we've got multiple areas having a lot of fire all at the same time. We have a lot less flexibility. And that's where we have to start making decisions about which fires to fight first.
1, 2, 3, right.
Caruso says working together across state and federal borders is key.
If the Forest Service does one thing over here, and the state of Washington is doing pretty much the same thing, but they're doing it over here, and then your private landowner maybe is doing something very similar over here, but everything in between is lower priority for all of them, then you're not getting nearly the benefits that you might have if we had moved all of those projects closer together. We'd like to see shared stewardship projects that actually cross boundaries.
Well, I'm not sure the federal situation is fixable in the short term. We've got 120 years of fire suppression, which was well-intentioned, but we found out that we just build up a fuel load, and now we don't have fires like we had 100 years ago. We have really high intensity with 10 times the fuel that was there when things were in a natural state.
But Commissioner Franz says the state is also accountable.
For us, the hardest part about this, about fighting fires, is that the state has underinvested in wildfire resources, in forest health resources, and in community resilience.
This is House Bill 1168. This invests in statewide wildfire response and forest restoration.
And the state's response, a wildfire strategic plan under the Forest Health Bill of 2021, which was signed into law with unanimous support.
We're going to be lockstep in partnering with them to get them there. The goal is to set clear targets, to be a partner with them in helping them go faster and make sure they achieve those targets.
The bill was sponsored by Representatives Springer and Kretz, with Commissioner Franz's help. It commits $125 million funding every 2 years for the next 8 years. That's $70 million for wildfire response, which would employ more firefighters and upgrade equipment and helicopters. $30 million to restore and fireproof forests, and $25 million to make communities firewise and educate the public on wildfire resilience.
So we specifically set forth at a watershed level what needs to happen in that watershed to restore the health of those forests, not looking at the property lines, just looking at the land, looking at the condition of the forest.
But what about the shared accountability over boundaries?
If it's a private landowner, we can do a cost share, we can bring resources to help them, right? On the federal lands, we signed an agreement, the Good Neighbor Authority, that enables us to do projects with the federal government.
Commissioner Franz believes the bill will change the trajectory of wildfire destruction and prevent tragedies from becoming the norm in Washington state.
When we have the wildfire response resources up front, we can be more strategic and smart, and we can get on the fires quickly, and we're not sitting there spending an enormous amount of time trying to find them while all hell's breaking loose up and down the West Coast.
I'm just going to make sure that line is plugged in. Feels like we have fuel and the vent is open.
Now we're training thousands of firefighters a year to make sure that they have the critical training they need, not just the entry level, but also so we can be building up the expertise and leadership skills we need for all the different levels that firefighting needs.
As for maintaining Washington's forests, the bill is poised to accelerate those efforts too.
We're on the right track with our thinning, and then followed by a prescribed burn, and we've got some challenges there.
A reality that the Forest Service agrees with. As Caruso says, we're not quite there yet.
We need to do about 6 times as much prescribed fire and burning as we're currently doing, just to kind of sustain the status quo.
The Forest Health Bill, funded in part by state taxes and federal COVID relief money, shows a promising start. Although one of the things it doesn't address is the aftermath. The damage that wildfires leave in their wake. The funds don't cover respite for families that lost their homes, and a number of them are uninsured. When posed with that question, Representative Springer said it's more of a prevention over cure approach.
The bill does not address making communities whole again. The legislature has always been in a position, if wildfires break out, we have to put them out at some point and we have to pay for that. What the bill's trying to do is to make that after fire cost less than it is now.
He says families affected by fires can count on federal aid.
In the case of a town like Malden, we probably would more likely depend on FEMA, the Federal Disaster Assistance Program, for making communities whole again as best we can.
But with wildfires becoming increasingly erratic, others see how that could be an unreliable strategy.
It isn't realistic anymore to just think the federal government can take care of every state as more and more of these disasters are hitting all of our states.
FEMA is not set up to deal with fires. FEMA was set up for disasters that are kind of specifically unique to populated areas.
We need to now say what additional investments need to be made that Washington State is going to be more dependable on itself, not just up front for these and reducing these natural disasters and having the resources to respond to them, but also on the back end when a community gets hit hard by them.
So, how do we know if the bill works? Apparently, it's a matter of scale, and one that requires a cautiously optimistic approach.
What we don't know and won't for a couple of years is whether we have allocated enough money to the forest health part especially. We don't know how big that problem is. We know it's big, but without the mapping and the actual boots on the ground in the forest sort of looking at areas that need treatment, it's hard to know whether we have appropriated enough money for that.
And Representative Kretz says he has faith in the process.
I was at a friend's place over here during the Walker fire, and some good friends, and he's in a wheelchair, and they got their kids out of there, but they're going to stay. They're going to save their place one way or another. And I was there, a number of friends were there, people brought equipment. That's how it works here. And here it came, and the wind picked up, and that fire was coming down from Bonaparte right toward their place. And we were kind of thinking, this is it, getting everything wetted down. And all of a sudden there's this roar, and a DC-10 comes over the ridge. Everything turns orange, including us, and it's well worth it. You know, I mean, you see something like that, you knew that we made some progress.
And that progress doesn't always come easy. For a bill that wedges the gap between federal and state accountability and brings together opposite sides of Washington State, it was a hard-earned win.
It surprised me how few legislators in Western Washington really understood how significant our wildfire crisis was and cared, to be honest. I mean, it was seen so much as an Eastern Washington issue.
There was a lot more interest in it. I think it was more real to people. I think we've gotten better and better at explaining it in terms that somebody in downtown Seattle can understand.
This is a growing problem. It is not going to get any better. Hoping for a damp, wet summer is not a strategy, other than a wing and a prayer that it rains a lot some summer. That's just not going to do it.
If we had not seen an increasing number of fires on the west side, if we had not tragically lost a little boy's life and an entire town, if the air quality hadn't been as bad from Spokane to Seattle, second time out of 3 years, there probably wouldn't have been the urgency and the sense of, I'll be frank, moral responsibility to do something by the legislature.
I find it really encouraging that the state is really taking these issues seriously, because I know how hard they are to work through. I mean, I work for the government, and I admit we don't always see that.
Washington State's differing opinions have proven to be perhaps the biggest chink in its armor against wildfires. But it also made state leaders realize their best line of defense: bipartisanship and working across borders.
Too often in government, we politicize an issue. And politicizing an issue may get headlines, but it does not get action.
Fire is not political, or it shouldn't be, you know, and there's different people want to inject politics into it, and we can all play that game. But I was really grateful this year that the legislature really came together.
And it is with that partnership that they continue their efforts in narrowing Washington's wildfire divide.
When you have that kind of support for an issue as emotional and as catastrophic as wildfires have been, it's a really good indication that the bill is going to live for a long time and continue to be funded.
This was not a debate about who's right or who's wrong. It was very much about what needed to be done if we're truly going to prevent the Evergreen State turning charcoal black.
You know, fires, it's not a partisan thing. It affects everybody in the state, and I think that there's more of an understanding of that. I think we've had fires on the west side. We haven't had the big catastrophic ones yet, but boy, they're coming.